Thanks for staying with us now. Also on Thursday, October 20, marked the date when the military government in charge promised to hand over power and return the country to a democracy. Sadly, on the set date, nothing like that happened. Instead, less than 2 weeks before, on October 10, General Muhammad Idris Deby Itno was sworn in as transitional president for another 2 years. Angered by this development, hundreds of demonstrators turned out in the Chadian capital of N'Djamena on Thursday to demand an end to military rule. Unfortunately, these protests turned into deadly clashes between the police and demonstrators, leaving about 30 people dead, including members of the security forces, according to an official toll. France, Chad's former colonial power, condemned the violence, noting it featured the use of lethal weapons against demonstrators. Head of the African Union Commission, Musa Faki Mohammed, also wrote on Twitter that he firmly condemns the repression of the protests and called for peaceful ways to overcome the country's crisis. And now joining us for this conversation, we have Abdulateef Ahmed as the head of research and monitoring unit right here in News Central TV. Thank you so much for joining us, Abdulateef.
Thank you for having me. Good evening.
Good evening. Now, you saw the reports of the happenings in Chad. Unfortunately, we had different news about 30 people dead, a lot of people injured. This is because of the fact that these demonstrators were clamoring for back to civilian rule. Now, what would you make of these demonstrations? Do you think that the president will be moved to listen to the pleas of these people?
First, it is sad that we had a protest in Chad, and it resulted into the death of several civilians. It was avoidable. Protests are a legitimate means of expressing dissatisfaction with government or governance in a country. What happened was avoidable, and we hope such will not reoccur in the nearest future. Why this is important is that when grievances are being expressed, in a democratic setting, it is expected that those in power will be willing and able to listen and address these concerns. Yesterday was 20th of October, a day that coincides with the memorial of people who were repressed and attacked by the government forces in Nigeria. So it becomes another dark cloud in the history of Chad. So those grievances were about the extension of the government tenure of Muhammad. Initially, he had agreed to stay in power for 18 months, and he only called on the opposition some weeks back to agree on another extension, by 2 years, and this is the bone of contention.
Now, with this protest going on, as I rightly said earlier, do you think that Muhammad Idris Deby, he took over after his father died when he was battling with rebel forces. Do you think he would listen to the pleas of the people?
If he would listen to the plea of the people, he would have by now taken the concerns of the opposition parties who refused to join in the deliberations. And the reason why they refused to join in the deliberation was that they understand that the intention to stay a little longer in power is an unpopular position. And this is why they should have been called, to the table, and deliberations should have been in such a way that it will be as inclusive as possible. So the government decided to take on the prime minister, who has always been a frontliner in the opposition, to become the prime minister in order to give it some level of legitimacy. However, it still doesn't represent the general wishes and, concerns of people in Chad.
Now, looking at the African Union, it has received a lot of criticisms that it did not condemn when the son Deby took over power, just like it did in Burkina Faso and Guinea. Do you see African Union guilty of this?
Well, the much that African Union can do is to express concerns. There's hardly anything it can do to force a regime change or to force democratic elections to hold. What is most important is the stability and peace in the country. And as long as there's a debt, there has to be a vacuum that has to be filled. And unless there is constitutional provision to fill that vacuum, a president that has been in power for several decades would have ruled in a way that it will be more militarized than a democratic setting. So What the current president is doing is simply to fill in the gap, and hopefully he'll be able to conduct a peaceful election to usher in a democratic government.
Okay, finally, how much support does Debbie have at the moment? I know his father had the support of France. How much support does he have?
Debbie has a lot of support across the country, all politicians and several political groups, including rebel groups. However, some of the opposition members do not agree with his intention to extend the tenure elongation. So he only enjoys the popular will of the late Debbie, but the opposition, you cannot run a country based on the love for president or the love for who sits in for the president. Essentially, it is an issue of constitutionality, and it goes beyond how much support, but on what is constitutionally right. So what is expected of him, especially from the concerns of opposition parties like the Transformers Party, is for him to conduct an election and leave the space, because he is not being formally elected by the popularity of the people.
All right, unfortunately, we'll have to let you go here. Thank you so much, Abdulateef Ahmed. Unfortunately, October 20, as you rightly said, has cast a very dark shadow on the African continent. Thank you so much for joining us in the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
And this is where we'll draw the curtains for today's edition of The Conversation. Earlier on, we talked about the 2 years memorial walk stage in Nigeria. And the protesters are still demanding that people were killed on October 20, 2020. While the state government invalidates this report, we also have discussions in Chad where a series of protests occurred in the Chad's capital, N'Djamena, leading to over 30 people dying as they call for a return to civilian rule. I am Rita Omodia. Do join us again next week for another edition of The Conversation. Bye-bye.